She is lying for sympathy. She was never even pregnant, Mom whispered to the pastor's wife. I heard every word from the pew behind her. I stood up, walked to the front, and handed the pastor one envelope. He opened it and went silent, then said, "Ma'am, this is a..." My name is Emily Miller. I'm 31 years old, and I analyze financial discrepancies for a living. I am a forensic accountant based out of Birmingham, Alabama. My job is to find the missing decimal, the hidden transfer, the lie, buried in a stack of 1099s. Numbers do not lie, people do. But what my mother Barbara forgot when she decided to build an empire of lies on top of my grief is that she raised a daughter who knows exactly how to read the receipts. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people face impossible families and quiet courage always gets the last word. If a story has ever made you feel less alone in your own struggles, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. The fluorescent lights in exam room 4 hummed. It was a low mechanical buzz that vibrated against the back of my skull. I sat on the edge of the examination table, clutching the crinkling tissue paper beneath my legs. David stood next to me. He smelled like motor oil and cedar, the permanent scent of a man who spends his days restoring classic cars. He took off his denim jacket and wrapped it around my shivering shoulders. The heavy weight of the fabric was the only thing keeping me anchored to the floor. 14 weeks. We had spent a year tracking ovulation cycles, adjusting diets, waiting. The ultrasound screen, usually a source of quiet awe, was dark and still. The technician had averted her eyes. The doctor used the term fetal demise. I did not cry in the clinic. The grief was too heavy to carry sound. Telling my parents was supposed to be the safety net. That is what families do. In Alabama, they close ranks. They bring casseroles. They pray. David drove us to my parents' brick colonial in Vestavia Hills that evening. We sat in their pristine living room. I spoke the words into the quiet space between the ticking grandfather clock and the embroidered throw pillows. We lost the baby. My mother Barbara did not put down her teacup. She took a slow sip, set the china on its saucer, and smoothed her skirt. Emily, it was barely the first trimester, she said, her tone as even as a metronome. Let's not be dramatic. It was likely just a heavy cycle. Women go through this all the time. My father Richard kept his eyes on the television, watching a golf tournament on mute. He offered a faint nod, signaling the conversation was over. David's jaw tightened. I felt the heat radiating from him, the urge to speak, to defend. I reached under the glass coffee table and placed my hand over his knee. I squeezed twice. Do not engage. I swallowed the pain, pushing it down into the dark, quiet filing cabinets of my mind. I chose silence because arguing with Barbara about my own physical reality was a battle I had lost since childhood. If you have ever shrunk yourself to fit into a room where your pain was treated as an inconvenience, you know the particular chill of that drive home. Drop a like if you know what it feels like to be managed rather than loved. The silence lasted for 4 days, a cold, structured quiet. Then the mail arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a thick cream envelope with a gold seal, a mandatory invitation to Sunday dinner, a dinner my mother only hosted when she had an announcement to make. And I had no idea her announcement would require erasing my tragedy from the family record. The drive back to the brick colonial in Vestavia Hills felt like navigating a vehicle through quicksand. Sunday dinners at my parents' house were never casual meals. They were curated events. My mother Barbara required everyone to play their assigned roles. My role was the audience. The spotlight belonged to my younger sister Sarah. Sarah is 28 years old. She married a commercial real estate broker named Bradley, who wears custom suits and smells like expensive cologne and unearned confidence. Sarah has spent her entire life collecting achievements that fit perfectly into a picture frame. First chair in the symphony, sorority president, country club member. While I spent my 20s hunched over financial audits, trying to find truth in spreadsheets, Sarah learned how to smile for the camera. My mother called her the jewel of the family. I was just the administrative support. We walked through the front door. The scent of roasted rosemary and floor wax hung in the air. The dining room table was set with the good china and the heavy silver flatware. Barbara orchestrated the seating arrangements with the precision of a military general. I was placed at the far end near the kitchen swing door, a physical demotion. David sat beside me, his jaw already set in a rigid line. My body still ached. The physical recovery from a 14-week pregnancy loss does not vanish in 4 days. A dull, heavy cramping radiated through my lower back, a constant reminder of the empty space inside me. I shifted in my chair, trying to find a position that did not pull at my muscles. Nobody asked how I was feeling. Nobody offered a glass of water. The rule of the house was simple. If Barbara did not acknowledge it, it did not exist. Bradley spent the first course talking loudly about his recent commercial leases. He chewed his steak and gestured with his fork, detailing a multi-million-dollar warehouse deal near the interstate. Richard nodded in approval, pouring more red wine into his glass. Sarah sat next to her husband, glowing, radiating a nervous energy that seemed to vibrate off her skin. She kept adjusting the napkin on her lap, exchanging knowing glances with our mother across the table. I kept my eyes on my plate. I pushed a piece of asparagus around the porcelain rim, calculating the minutes until we could leave. Then I dropped my linen napkin. It slipped off my lap and fell under the table. I leaned down to retrieve it. The heavy mahogany table muffled the sounds of the room, creating a strange pocket of acoustics. Barbara was seated at the head of the table just a few feet away from me. Bradley was leaning in toward her. I reached for the white fabric on the rug, and that is when I heard my mother speak. Her voice was low, conspiratorial, and sharp as a scalpel. She did not know I was listening. "I am just glad Emily is finally dropping this phantom delusion," Barbara whispered to Bradley. "You know how she gets. She saw all the attention Sarah has been receiving lately with the new house renovations. She just needed to invent a crisis to feel important." My hand froze on the napkin. The floor seemed to drop away, leaving me suspended in a freezing vacuum. A phantom delusion. Invented for attention? I am a forensic accountant. I look for the core motive behind a fraud. The motive here was not just denial. It was active, calculated invalidation. My mother was not just ignoring my miscarriage to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. She was actively rewriting my medical reality to brand me as a jealous, unstable liar. She was laying the groundwork to ensure that if I ever tried to talk about my grief, the rest of the family would view it as a pathetic grab for sympathy. I pulled myself back up in my chair. The room spun for a fraction of a second. I looked at Barbara. She was sipping her wine, her expression serene and composed. I looked at Bradley. He offered a small dismissive chuckle, shaking his head. I opened my mouth to speak. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the heavy mahogany table and watch the fine china shatter against the hardwood floor. I wanted to demand she look at the medical paperwork sitting on my kitchen counter. Before I could form a single syllable, Sarah tapped her silver knife against her crystal water glass. The sharp, high-pitched ring silenced the room. Sarah stood up. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress and beamed, her smile stretching wide. She looked at Richard, then at Barbara, and finally let her eyes settle on me. "Bradley and I have some incredible news," Sarah announced, her voice breathless with rehearsed excitement. "We are pregnant, 8 weeks along. The baby is due in the spring." The dining room erupted. Barbara gasped loudly, clapping her hands over her mouth in a display of pure, unadulterated joy. She rushed out of her chair to embrace Sarah. Richard stood up, patting Bradley hard on the back, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his usually stoic face. I sat frozen. 8 weeks. I had been 14 weeks along just 4 days ago. I had carried a child for over 3 months, and my mother had called it a heavy cycle. Sarah was 8 weeks along, and she was being treated like she had just performed a medical miracle. The sickening realization settled into my bones like lead. My grief was not just an inconvenience, it was a scheduling conflict. My mother had deliberately erased my trauma to clear the stage for the golden child. Barbara needed the spotlight to be empty so Sarah could step into it uncontested. My heartbreak was swept under the rug so my sister could have her perfect narrative. Richard walked over to the sideboard and picked up a bottle of expensive champagne he had clearly set aside for this exact moment. He popped the cork and poured the bubbling liquid into tall crystal flutes. He handed one to Bradley, one to Barbara, and raised his own glass high in the air. "To Sarah and Bradley," Richard boomed his voice, carrying through the dining room, "and to the first real grandchild of the Miller family." The crystal glasses clinked together. The bright sound rang through the air, vibrating in my ears. The first real grandchild. The 6 words hung over the table, finalizing the erasure of my baby. The sound of that clinking glass will echo in my mind forever. It was the sound of a family officially writing me out of their history. David did not pick up his glass. He stood up. He did not say a word to Richard. He did not congratulate Sarah. He took his linen napkin, dropped it directly onto the center of his untouched dinner plate, and walked behind my chair. He placed his warm, calloused hand firmly on my shoulder. "We are leaving," David said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal edge that cut straight through the celebration. Barbara turned, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before hardening into a scowl. "Emily, do not do this," she snapped, abandoning her sweet grandmother persona. "Do not ruin your sister moment just because you are feeling insecure. Have some grace." I stood up. My legs felt hollow, but David kept his hand on my lower back, guiding me forward. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at Sarah. I walked out of the dining room, down the front hall, and out the heavy front door into the muggy Alabama night. The tension inside the cab of David's truck was thick enough to choke on. The street lights flickered past the windshield, casting long, erratic shadows across his face. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, his knuckles were stark white. He did not turn on the radio. He did not offer empty platitudes. He just drove, his jaw clenched, radiating a quiet fury that matched my own. We got home and locked the door. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection. My eyes were dark and hollow. I looked like a woman who had just been erased. I went to sleep that night, wrapping myself in the heavy quilt on our bed, praying that the worst was over. I assumed the family had gotten what they wanted. They had their golden child and their perfect narrative. They would leave me alone to heal in peace. I was wrong. The invalidation was just the opening act. The next morning, the Alabama sun rose hot and bright. David left early for the garage. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee and walked out to the end of our driveway in my robe to check the mail. Inside the metal box, sitting underneath a stack of grocery store circulars, was a crisp white envelope. The return address was printed in sharp blue ink: Oak Creek Fellowship. It was the prominent megachurch our entire family attended, a sprawling campus that boasted thousands of members and immense social power in our town. Barbara was a pillar of the congregation. I stared at the church logo on the corner of the envelope, a strange knot forming in my stomach. I had not been to a service in over a month due to my health. I assumed it was a standard donation request, but the thickness of the paper felt wrong. It felt deliberate. The toxicity of the Sunday dinner had not stayed contained inside my parents' dining room. It had breached the church walls, and I was about to find out exactly how far my mother was willing to go. I stood at the edge of my driveway, the morning heat already baking the asphalt beneath my bare feet. I tore the flap of the crisp white envelope with my thumb. Inside was not a personal note. It was a standard trifold Sunday bulletin from Oak Creek Fellowship. The paper was glossy, printed in high-definition color. I flipped it open, scanning the weekly schedule, the youth ministry updates, the charity drive metrics. My eyes caught the pastoral notes section, but nothing stood out. Yet the sheer act of mailing it felt like a warning shot fired across my bow. Oak Creek is not just a church in our part of Alabama. It is the political and social epicenter of the county. The sanctuary holds 800 congregants. The parking lot requires 3 off-duty police officers to direct traffic. My mother sits on the advisory board. She oversees the community outreach budget. She wields her influence in those carpeted hallways the way a judge wields a gavel. In our town, Sunday attendance is a currency. Absence is a red flag. I walked back inside and set the glossy paper on the kitchen island. David was wiping down the stainless steel stovetop. I told him we needed to attend the upcoming Sunday service. He stopped moving the yellow sponge hovering over the burner. He looked at me, his eyes reminding me of the dining room table, the champagne glasses, the cold cruelty we had just escaped. I explained that in my mother world, skipping service after a family dispute is a silent admission of guilt. It signals weakness. We had to show our faces. We had to sit in our regular seats. We had to prove we were intact. David rinsed the sponge, squeezed the water down the drain, and offered a single, firm nod. Sunday morning arrived draped in thick, suffocating humidity. I wore a modest navy dress, a dark armor designed to deflect attention. David wore his tailored charcoal suit, his broad shoulders squared, scanning the sprawling church foyer like a security detail assessing threats. We walked through the towering glass double doors. The lobby smelled of expensive perfume, hairspray, and fresh roasted coffee. Greeters handed out the new bulletins at every entrance. I noticed Mrs. Henderson, the head usher, give me a tight, pitying smile. Her eyes darted away fast, focusing on the carpet rather than meeting my gaze. A strange, cold knot twisted in my gut. We found seats in the middle section, row J. The plush, theater-style seating offered no comfort. The stage was bathed in blue and purple wash lights, a high production value setup designed to evoke emotion. The worship band finished their final set, the heavy bass drums fading into the carpeted floor. Pastor Sterling walked up to the transparent acrylic podium. He is a tall man with distinguished silver hair and a voice trained to project authority and compassion simultaneously. He opened his leather-bound binder. The congregation settled into a quiet hush, the kind of attentive silence reserved for important announcements. He announced it was time for congregational concerns. He cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke into the lapel microphone, his deep baritone echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Today we have a special intercessory request from one of our most devoted lay leaders, Barbara Miller, he began. My lungs seized. I stared at the back of the balding man in the row directly ahead of me. Pastor Sterling continued, his tone dripping with practiced pastoral sorrow. Barbara asks for our collective prayers for her eldest daughter, Emily. She asks that we pray for Emily to find mental clarity and healing from her delusions of motherhood. I stopped breathing. He did not pause. He requested that God grant this young woman peace from the phantom grief clouding her mind, so she may seek proper psychiatric care and rejoice in the true blessings arriving in their family. The words dropped from the overhead speakers like heavy stones splashing into a stagnant pond. I sat paralyzed. I could not inhale. I could not blink. The sanctuary fell into a deafening silence for one agonizing second. Then came the sound. The dry, simultaneous rustling of hundreds of thick paper bulletins turning over at once. 800 people checking the printed prayer list on the back page. 800 heads shifting, craning their necks, searching the rows to find the unstable daughter Barbara had just diagnosed from the pulpit. The friction of the paper sounded like a swarm of locusts descending on the room. This was not a private slight. This was the weaponization of faith. My mother had used the most sacred, trusted platform in our community to brand me a pathological liar. She turned a sanctuary into a tribunal, and I was convicted without a trial. The women who used to ask me for financial advice were now staring at me with expressions caught between horror and morbid fascination. They were looking at a madwoman. My mother had successfully immunized herself against any future truth I might try to tell. Who would believe a woman the whole church was praying for due to her mental delusions? A strong, calloused hand clamped over mine. David. His grip was tight, his knuckles stark white against his tan skin. He did not wait for my cue. He did not care about interrupting the sacred, quiet moment. He stood up, pulling me up with him by the arm. We sidestepped past 4 people in our row. An elderly woman pulled her leather purse closer to her chest as I squeezed by, shrinking away as if my grief were a contagious disease. The walk down the long carpeted center aisle felt like marching underwater. Every eye in the building bore into my spine. Pastor Sterling had stopped speaking, watching us leave. The only sound in the enormous room was the heavy, rhythmic thud of David's leather dress shoes hitting the floorboards, marching us toward the exit. He pushed the heavy glass doors open, shattering the air-conditioned silence with the harsh roar of highway traffic outside. We did not speak on the ride home. The alienation was instantaneous. By Monday morning, my phone went dead. No text messages from the women in my small group, no check-ins from the neighbors who attended the early service. My mother had drawn a boundary line around me, and the entire community stayed safely on her side. The isolation stretched on for weeks. The silence in our house grew heavy, pressing against the windows. I retreated into the only world that made sense to me: data, spreadsheets, ledgers. Numbers do not gossip. They do not rewrite history. They balance or they do not balance. To distract my mind from the haunting memory of those turning heads in the pews, I decided to do a comprehensive mid-year review of our household taxes. It was late on a Tuesday evening. I sat at my home office desk, surrounded by organized stacks of tax forms, utility receipts, and mortgage statements. I pulled up our digital portal to cross-reference our incoming mail. David walked in from the garage, smelling of oil and solvent, and dropped a stack of unopened envelopes from the past week onto my desk. I sliced through the pile with a metal letter opener, categorizing each one by date and sender. At the bottom of the stack was an official document bearing the stark, recognizable seal of the Internal Revenue Service. It was a 1099 MISC income form. It was addressed directly to me, Emily Miller, utilizing my full legal name and Social Security number. I unfolded the stiff paper, smoothing the sharp crease against the mahogany desk. My eyes scanned the standardized boxes. It stated I had received a significant financial grant, a payout of $25,000, money I had never seen requested or deposited into any of our accounts. I traced the printed text with my index finger, my forensic training overriding my fatigue. I looked at Box 3, identifying the issuer of the funds. The name printed in stark black ink made the blood freeze in my veins, introducing a bizarre mystery that proved the cruelty of my family went far deeper than public humiliation. The name printed in Box 3 of the tax form stared back at me in stark, unfeeling black ink. Oak Creek Fellowship Benevolent Fund. The paper was thick, high-quality cardstock. My thumb traced the edge of the document, applying just enough pressure that the sharp, stiff crease sliced a tiny paper cut across my skin. A single bead of red welled up, stinging against the cool air of the room. I did not wipe it away. The sharp, sudden pain anchored me to the present moment. It dragged my mind out of the fog of grief and thrust it into the cold, calculated realm of my profession. The form documented a scheduled disbursement of $25,000. The category code in the adjacent box designated the funds as a crisis grant for medical debt relief. My mind began running the variables, sorting facts from fiction. David and I have premium health insurance through his restoration business. Our policy covered the clinic visits in full. We paid a $50 specialist copay with a debit card on the afternoon we lost the baby. We possessed zero medical debt. Furthermore, we had never applied for financial assistance from anyone, let alone the church that had just publicly shunned me. For the past 5 weeks, I had been a grieving mother, drowning in sorrow, shrinking under the weight of my family judgment. In one breath, that vulnerable woman vanished. The forensic accountant took her place. In my line of work, fraud always leaves a fingerprint. People assume financial crimes are sophisticated, orchestrated by calculating masterminds. In reality, most embezzlement is sloppy. It is committed by individuals who believe they are untouchable, blinded by their own arrogance and perceived authority. They leave paper trails because they assume nobody will ever dare to look closely. My family always dismissed my career as boring. They called me a human calculator. They failed to realize that human calculators do not feel intimidated by bullies. We only care about the math. I booted up my work laptop. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across the dark mahogany of my home office desk. I opened a new encrypted spreadsheet, my hands moving over the keyboard with practiced muscle memory. Oak Creek Fellowship operates as a tax-exempt religious organization. However, any entity distributing large sums of money must maintain ledgers and file federal returns. A church benevolent fund is a specific pool of charity money designed to aid congregants facing catastrophic ruin, such as losing a home to a fire or battling a terminal illness. It is sacred money. I logged into a public database that tracks nonprofit tax filings. I pulled the most recent federal forms for Oak Creek Fellowship. Nonprofits are required by law to disclose their key officers, board members, and high-ranking fiduciaries. I scrolled through the digital documents, skipping past the mission statements and the general revenue summaries. I located the specific schedule detailing the board of directors and committee chairs. My eyes scanned down the alphabetical list of names, looking for the specific individuals who held the power to authorize a $25,000 payout. I stopped scrolling. There it was, Barbara Miller, title, Treasurer and Benevolent Fund Committee Chair. The puzzle pieces locked into a horrifying, seamless picture. My mother had not just dismissed my 14-week pregnancy loss, she had not just used it to gain sympathy points at Sunday service. She had monetized my tragedy. Barbara had drafted a fictitious narrative about her daughter suffering under crushing medical debt due to a tragic miscarriage. She used that story to bypass standard committee approvals, authorizing a massive charity payout directly from the church coffers. Then she had Pastor Sterling read that intercessory prayer request on Sunday morning to discredit my mental state. It was a preemptive strike. If I ever found out about the money and tried to report the theft, the entire congregation would just assume I was suffering from the very psychiatric delusions they were praying away. It was a perfect chilling cover-up, designed to paint her as a saint and me as a lunatic. The office door creaked open. David walked in carrying 2 ceramic mugs of green tea. He saw my posture rigid and unblinking in front of the monitors. He set the mugs on a coaster, leaned over my chair, and looked at the glowing screens. I handed him the stiff IRS tax form. I pointed to the public filing displaying my mother name. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in the flat, measured tone I use when presenting audit findings to corporate clients. David read the documents. He is a man who fixes broken systems for a living. He understands how machines operate. He saw the broken, toxic machinery of my family laid bare right in front of him. His expression did not change to shock. It shifted into a cold, hardened focus. He placed his warm hand on the back of my neck, his thumb resting steady against my pulse. He asked me one single question. Where did the cash go? I explained the mechanics of a payout this size. A check for $25,000 cannot simply be cashed at a bank teller window for paper bills. It must be deposited into a verified checking or savings account. Because the IRS form was generated under my Social Security number, the check was written directly to me. To deposit it, someone had to forge my signature on the endorsement line. Then they had to route it into a bank account they controlled. If you have ever discovered that the person who was supposed to protect you was actually using your pain for spare parts, drop a single word in the comments. Betrayal. I will read them all. To secure the evidence, I needed the digital check images. I needed to see the routing number printed on the back of the endorsed check. Once I had that 9-digit code, I could identify exactly which bank received the stolen charity funds and ultimately whose name was on that account. Standard consumer banking protocols require weeks to process a fraud claim and produce duplicate check scans. I did not have weeks. I needed to act before Barbara realized the federal government had automatically generated a tax form to my legal residential address, a bureaucratic failsafe she had clearly overlooked in her arrogance. I opened my professional banking software portal. I had high-level clearance through my firm to request expedited financial traces for suspected identity theft and corporate fraud. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard, ready to input the church tax identification number and pull the routing data. The quiet hum of the computer cooling fan was the only sound in the house. I pressed the first key, beginning the secure query. Before I could strike the second key, a heavy, rapid pounding echoed from the first floor. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of fists hammering against the solid oak wood of our front door, shaking the glass panes in the foyer. The heavy pounding echoed from the foyer, vibrating up the wooden staircase and shaking the frame photographs on the hallway walls. David had just stepped out the back door to his detached workshop, firing up the industrial air compressor to clean a carburetor part. The roar of his machinery masked the noise at the front of the house. I was alone. I left the glowing computer monitors behind my bare feet, padding softly against the hardwood floors as I descended the stairs. I expected to find a delivery driver impatient for a signature. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled open the heavy oak door. The sweltering Alabama heat rolled into the foyer, carrying the cloying scent of expensive floral perfume. Barbara and Sarah stood on my welcome mat. They did not wait for an invitation. My mother pushed past me, her designer handbag brushing against my ribs, marching directly into my home as if she held the deed. Sarah trailed closely behind her, sipping an iced latte, checking her phone with an air of profound boredom. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Barbara did not stop to greet me. She did not ask how I was coping. She bypassed the living room entirely, her low heels clicking sharply against the floorboards as she headed straight for the staircase. Sarah followed her, her eyes scanning my home with a critical, dismissive sweep. Growing up, my younger sister never learned the concept of boundaries. If Sarah broke a toy, Barbara would simply walk into my room, take mine, and hand it to her. She called it sharing. I learned very early that my possessions, my space, and my achievements were always considered communal property, ready to be repurposed whenever the golden child experienced a minor inconvenience. I had long accepted that dynamic regarding clothes or electronics. I never imagined it would apply to the ghost of my unborn child. I followed them up the stairs, my pulse quickening. My mother walked down the second-floor hallway with lethal purpose, heading directly toward the closed white door at the very end of the corridor, the spare room, the nursery. Inside that room sat 3 large, unopened cardboard boxes containing a handcrafted mahogany crib. David and I had spent months researching that specific piece of furniture. We ordered it from a boutique artisan. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of our new life, a tangible symbol of the future we were building. After the clinic visit, David had shut that door, and neither of us had turned the handle since. Barbara stopped in front of the nursery. She dropped her designer handbag onto a nearby console table. Sarah ordered custom furniture for her nursery weeks ago, Barbara stated, not looking at me, her tone clipped and transactional. The boutique just called her. There is a supply chain issue. Her pieces will not arrive until after the baby is born. That is unacceptable for the shower photos. We came to get your crib. I froze, staring at the back of my mother's perfectly coiffed hair. The sheer audacity of the demand stole the breath from my lungs. She had not come to check on my well-being. She had come to harvest the remnants of my shattered dreams to decorate my sister-perfect life. "You cannot be serious," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Sarah sighed loudly, rattling the ice cubes in her plastic cup. "Emily, do not make this difficult. Bradley and I have a specific aesthetic we are trying to maintain. Your crib is a neutral mahogany. It fits our color palette. It is just sitting there collecting dust." I stepped in front of Sarah, blocking her path. I looked into her eyes, searching for a single shred of remorse, a sliver of empathy. There was nothing, just the hollow entitlement of a woman who had been trained to view my grief as a logistical obstacle. "No," I said. Barbara scoffed. She reached around me, her hand closing over the brass hardware of the nursery door. She twisted her wrist. The metallic rattle of the spare room doorknob echoed down the quiet hallway. The sharp mechanical sound sliced through the heavy silence of the house. The lock held firm. David had engaged the deadbolt on the inside using a master key before pulling the door shut, protecting the space from intruders. Barbara twisted the knob again, rattling the metal frame harder, her jaw tightening in frustration. "Open this door right now, Emily. We brought Bradley truck. It is parked down the street." I reached out and placed my hand firmly over hers, stopping the brass knob from turning. I pried her fingers away from the metal, peeling her hand back with a cold, unyielding grip. I said no, I repeated, standing tall. My mother stepped back, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She looked at me, not as a grieving daughter, but as a disobedient subordinate. She smoothed her silk blouse, her expression hardening into a mask of pure contempt. "Since you do not actually need it," Barbara said, her voice dripping with venom, "and Sarah has a real baby coming, it is only fair." The words struck my chest like a physical blow. The absolute lack of empathy radiated from her pores. She was attempting to literally strip my home of my baby memory, to pack up the physical evidence of my hope and hand it to the sister who had erased my trauma just days prior. It was a calculated, deliberate attempt to break my spirit and reinforce my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Sarah crossed her arms and her lower lip jutting out in a performative pout. "You are being so selfish," she whined, stomping her foot against the floorboards. "I am pregnant. I am stressed. You are supposed to support me. Why are you hoarding baby furniture when you are empty inside anyway?" My forensic training kicked in, overriding the rising tide of tears threatening to spill over my eyelashes. I analyzed their posture, their demands, their cruelty. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to start crying, to apologize, to hand over the keys to the room just to make the conflict stop. That was the old Emily, the Emily who swallowed her pain at the Sunday dinner table. That Emily died in exam room 4. I looked at my mother, locking my gaze onto hers. "You are selfish and deeply unwell," Barbara hissed, trying to seize the final word. "You need psychiatric intervention. You are punishing your sister because your own body failed you." "Get out of my house," I said. My voice was not loud, it was terrifyingly calm. It carried the weight of a judge reading a final sentence. Barbara blinked, startled by the flat, dead tone of my command. "Excuse me?" she stammered. I pointed my index finger down the staircase toward the foyer. "Get out of my house right now, or I will call the police and have you both removed for trespassing." Sarah let out a dramatic gasp, dropping her iced coffee cup. The plastic cracked against the hardwood, a puddle of brown liquid seeping into the expensive rug. "Are you threatening your own family?" she shrieked. "You are not my family," I replied, my eyes never leaving my mother's face. "You are intruders. Leave." Barbara stared at me for 3 long seconds. She saw the shift in my posture. She recognized that the invisible leash she had held around my neck for 3 decades had just snapped. She snatched her designer handbag off the console table, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and shock. "Come on, Sarah," Barbara spat, turning on her heel. "Let us leave her to her delusions. We do not need her broken things anyway." They marched down the stairs. I followed them, watching as they stepped over the threshold and out onto the front porch. I grabbed the heavy oak door and slammed it shut, the sound booming through the foyer like a cannon blast. I engaged the deadbolt, sliding the heavy metal lock into place with a satisfying click. I leaned my back against the solid wood, sliding down until I hit the floor. The adrenaline crashed through my nervous system, leaving my hands trembling and my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I had just set my first hard boundary. I had looked the monsters in the eye and locked them out of my castle. 10 minutes later, the back door opened. David walked inside, wiping his grease-stained hands on a shop towel. He found me sitting in the foyer, staring at the spilled coffee soaking into the hallway runner rug. I explained what had happened, my voice monotone, reciting the facts of the ambush. His face darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes. He dropped the shop towel and took 3 long strides across the room and pulled me up into a fierce embrace. He told me he was proud of me. He told me we were changing the locks that afternoon. The walls of the house suddenly felt tight, pressing inward. The smell of Sarah perfume lingered in the air, a toxic reminder of the invasion. I needed to breathe. I needed open space, bright lights, and the mundane normalcy of a public space to ground my racing thoughts. I told David I was going to run to the grocery store to grab cleaning supplies for the rug. He offered to go with me, but I insisted on taking the short drive alone. I needed the quiet of my car. I drove to the large supermarket on the edge of town, the tires humming against the hot pavement. I walked through the automatic sliding doors, letting the frigid air conditioning wash over my flushed skin. I grabbed a red plastic basket and headed toward the produce section, focusing on the vibrant colors of the bell peppers and apples, forcing my brain to process simple, uncomplicated data. I rounded the corner of the organic vegetable display, my eyes fixed on a bundle of cilantro. I reached out to grab the damp green leaves. The supermarket produce aisle was supposed to be a neutral zone. The automatic misters hummed to life above the leafy greens, spraying a fine, cool fog over the display. I stood under the bright fluorescent lights, breathing in the earthy scent of wet soil and fresh vegetables. It was a mundane chore, a simple task meant to ground my racing heart after locking my own mother out of my house. I reached out my fingers, closing around a damp bundle of cilantro. I looked up and my fleeting sense of safety vanished. Standing directly across the narrow aisle, positioned between the organic tomatoes and the bell peppers, was Patricia Sterling. Patricia is the gatekeeper of Oak Creek Fellowship. She is married to the senior pastor, but everyone in our congregation knows she wields the true administrative power. She decides which families receive meal trains during difficult times and which families are quietly omitted from the prayer lists. She wears tailored beige pantsuits and a heavy silver cross necklace that rests perfectly flat against her collarbone. Her hair is styled into a rigid, immaculate helmet that never moves, even in the humid southern wind. To cross Patricia is to accept social exile in our town. I did not want a confrontation. I kept my eyes focused on the cilantro, hoping she would simply walk past me. I placed the wet herbs into my red plastic basket and turned toward the dairy section. "Emily," Patricia said. Her voice was not warm. It carried the sharp, carrying resonance of a woman used to projecting her opinions across crowded fellowship halls. I stopped walking. I turned to face her, clutching the plastic basket handle. "Hello, Patricia," I replied, keeping my tone even and polite. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. She did not offer a comforting hug. She did not express sorrow for my recent loss. Instead, she looked me up and down with an expression of profound pity mixed with intense disapproval. "We need to have a serious conversation," Patricia announced. She spoke loud enough for the sound to carry down the aisle. An elderly man examining apples a few feet away paused, glancing over his shoulder. A young mother pushing a toddler in a shopping cart slowed her pace, her eyes darting between us. I tightened my grip on the basket. "I am just running a quick errand, Patricia. Today has been a long day." "I imagine it has been," she countered, crossing her arms over her chest. "It must be exhausting keeping up this performance. Your mother came to see me yesterday in tears. She is heartbroken, Emily. She does not know how to help you." My chest tightened. The calculated speed of my mother campaign was staggering. Barbara had not just submitted a prayer request. She was holding private consultations with the most influential gossip in the county. "There is no performance," I stated, my voice low. "I lost my baby. My mother is choosing to ignore a medical fact." Patricia shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin, disappointed line. "Stop it, Emily. Just stop. You need to stop telling these lies about a lost baby just to steal your sister's joy. It is unbecoming of a Christian woman, and it is deeply disturbing to watch." The words echoed in the cold air of the produce section. The young mother with the toddler stopped pretending not to listen and openly stared at me, her eyes wide with judgment. "You are a smart girl," Patricia continued, stepping even closer, her voice dropping into a harsh lecturing register. "But this jealousy over Sarah is twisting your mind, fabricating a pregnancy, inventing a tragedy just because the spotlight moved away from you. It is sick. You need to seek severe psychiatric help before you do something you regret." I stood frozen. I looked into her eyes, searching for a hint of doubt, a shadow of hesitation. There was none. She fully believed the narrative Barbara had constructed. "And furthermore," Patricia added, leaning in closer, her expensive floral perfume suffocating the smell of the fresh vegetables, "you are going to ruin your marriage if you keep this up. David is a patient man, but no husband can endure a wife who loses her grip on reality. Get help, Emily, for his sake." I looked down at my hand. The cold condensation from the bundle of wet cilantro I had just picked up was pooling in my palm. A single icy drop slid down my skin, dripping onto the pristine linoleum floor. Then another. The steady, rhythmic dripping matched the heavy pounding in my chest. I felt the physical sensation of the freezing water mixing with the nervous sweat on my skin. That tiny, grounding detail anchored me. The cold water clarified my thoughts. The heavy, suffocating sadness that had weighed me down for weeks evaporated. I realized just how methodically my mother had operated. She had not just planted a seed of doubt, she had poured concrete over my reputation. She had poisoned the entire town against me, isolating me entirely. The women I used to host for Bible study, the neighbors who waved from their driveways, the cashiers who recognized my face, they all viewed me through the distorted lens my mother provided. I was a pariah. I was the crazy daughter, the jealous, barren sister who made up a dead child for attention. The weight of this realization did not crush me. It liberated me. When you know the entire jury is rigged, you stop trying to plead your case. You stop trying to prove your innocence to people who have already built the gallows. The grief burned away, leaving something much more dangerous in its place. The sadness calcified into a cold, analytical anger. It was the precise, razor-sharp fury of an auditor who has just uncovered a fatal discrepancy in a fraudulent ledger. They wanted me to be hysterical. They wanted me to yell, to cry, to make a scene in the middle of the grocery store, proving their diagnosis correct. I refused to give them the data point. I looked Patricia in the eye. Her rigid, unblinking stare demanded a reaction. I did not give her one. I opened my hand and dropped the wet bundle of cilantro back onto the display rack. I set the red plastic shopping basket on the floor next to the organic tomatoes. "Have a good afternoon, Patricia," I said. My voice was entirely flat, devoid of emotion, devoid of tears. I turned my back on her and walked away. I felt the eyes of the other shoppers burning into my spine, but I kept my posture straight. I walked past the registers, stepping through the sliding automatic doors, letting the suffocating heat of the Alabama summer hit my face. I crossed the asphalt parking lot, the black surface radiating heat through the soles of my shoes. I unlocked my sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and shut the door, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. I did not start the engine right away. I pulled my phone from my purse, my fingers moving with swift, calculated purpose. I needed to call David. I needed to tell him the social exile was total, that the church was compromised, and that we needed to move to the next phase of securing the financial evidence against my mother. I dialed his number and pressed the phone to my ear. It rang twice before he answered. "David," I said, my voice steady. "We need to accelerate the timeline. Patricia just ambushed me at the store. The congregation thinks I am insane," Emily David said. His voice was tight, strained, lacking its usual warm resonance. I stopped. The background noise coming through the receiver was wrong. I did not hear the familiar hum of the air compressor or the rhythmic clinking of wrenches. I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a heavy metal toolbox slamming shut. "I cannot talk right now," David said, his tone dropping an octave, carrying a terrifying defensive edge I had rarely ever heard him use. "Why?" I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "What is happening?" "Because your father just walked into my shop," David replied, and he locked the garage door behind him. The line went dead, leaving nothing but the hollow, rhythmic tone of a disconnected call echoing in the silent cabin of my car. I sat in the grocery store parking lot, staring at the black screen of my phone. The stifling heat of the Alabama afternoon pressed against the windows, but a freezing chill radiated through my chest. My father, Richard, was not a man who visited automotive garages. He spent his days in air-conditioned executive suites and manicured golf courses. For him to drive across town to the industrial district and lock the door to my husband's workspace meant the family strategy had shifted. They realized they could not break me alone. They needed to strip away my only line of defense. David later told me exactly how the confrontation unfolded, detailing every cold calculation my father brought into that garage. David Restoration Shop sits on a dusty, sun-baked road on the outskirts of Birmingham. It is a corrugated steel building filled with the metallic scent of motor oil, welding exhaust, and old leather. David built his business from the concrete foundation up. He grew up in a chaotic, unpredictable household, which drove him to find solace in mechanics. An engine makes sense. If a part is broken, you diagnose it, you replace it, and the machine runs again. He operates on logic, loyalty, and hard work. He values truth over appearances, making him the exact opposite of the men in my family. Richard walked into the shop wearing a crisp pastel polo shirt and pressed khaki trousers, looking entirely out of place among the scattered tools and hydraulic lifts. David was bent over the open hood of a vintage Mustang, his hands coated in dark sludge, attempting to calibrate a stubborn carburetor. He heard the heavy metal door slide shut. He heard the distinct metallic snap of the deadbolt sliding into place. David straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He watched Richard step carefully over a coiled air hose, his face contorted in a mask of performative concern. Richard did not offer a greeting. He bypassed the pleasantries, stepping into the center of the bay, adopting the authoritative posture he used to intimidate junior executives at his firm. "We need to have a man-to-man conversation," Richard announced, his voice echoing off the high tin ceiling. David did not speak. He reached over to his rolling tool cart and picked up a square red shop rag. Richard took the silence as an invitation to continue. He shoved his hands into his pockets, shaking his head with a practiced sigh. "Look, David, I know you love her, but Emily is sick. She is losing her grip on reality. Barbara and I are terrified for her. This whole fantasy she has concocted about a lost pregnancy, this erratic behavior, it is a textbook psychological break. We are looking into long-term psychiatric facilities to get her the care she clearly needs." David stood motionless. He looked at the older man, analyzing the bold, horrific lie being spun right in front of him. Richard was attempting to rewrite my medical history to my own husband. "It is going to get worse," Richard pressed, taking another step forward. "She is going to drag you down with her. You have built a solid reputation here. Your best clients are the guys from my country club, wealthy men who trust you with their expensive toys. Those men talk, David. They gossip. You do not want a crazy, unstable wife hurting your bottom line. It makes you look weak. It makes you look like you cannot control your own house." The ultimate betrayal settled into the dusty air of the garage. My own father was attempting to weaponize David's livelihood against me. Richard was offering a clean, socially acceptable exit. He was giving David permission to abandon his grieving wife under the guise of protecting his business. It was a calculated effort to leave me isolated, friendless, and divorced, ensuring I would have zero credibility if I ever exposed the church funds. "You are a practical guy," Richard said, his tone softening into a conspiratorial whisper. "Cut your losses. File the divorce papers now before she does something to ruin your name. Barbara and I will even help cover your legal fees. We just want this nightmare to end." David did not yell. He did not throw a punch. He relied on the exact same cold, methodical patience he uses to dismantle a ruined engine block. He held the red shop rag in his hands. He pressed it against his right palm slowly and deliberately, wiping the thick black engine grease from his skin. He rubbed the fabric over his knuckles, cleaning the dark grime from his cuticles. He took his time, letting the silence stretch, forcing Richard to stand there and wait. The metallic ticking of the cooling Mustang engine was the only sound in the building. David finished cleaning his right hand. He switched the red rag to the other side, methodically wiping the thick grease from his left palm. The quiet action carried a terrifying, unyielding weight. David tossed the stained red rag onto the metal workbench. He looked Richard dead in the eye. "Are you finished?" David asked, his voice low, steady, and devoid of any respect. Richard blinked, taken aback by the lack of compliance. "David, I am trying to save you from a sinking ship. You are standing in my shop," David said, taking one slow step toward my father. "And you were speaking about my wife, the woman who actually lost a child 4 weeks ago while you sat on your couch watching golf." Richard opened his mouth to argue, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. "Do not speak," David commanded, the authority in his voice slicing through the humid air like a blade. "You do not get to come into my sanctuary and try to buy my loyalty. Emily is twice the person anyone in your hollow, pathetic family will ever be. She is hurting because she lost our baby, and she is hurting because she had the misfortune of being born to cowards." Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to regain his dominant posture. "You watch your tone with me, son. You rely on my network for this business. I rely on my own 2 hands," David corrected, stepping so close that Richard was forced to lean back. "I do not care about your country club. I do not care about your money. If every client from your circle pulls their business today, I will sweep the floors of this garage before I ever betray my wife." David reached around Richard, grabbed the brass handle of the deadbolt, and snapped it open. He grabbed the heavy metal door and shoved it along its track, the steel rollers grinding loudly as the afternoon sunlight flooded into the dim garage. "Get off my property," David stated, pointing toward the gravel driveway. "And if you ever step foot near me or my wife again, we will not be having a conversation." Richard stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his corporate intimidation tactics crumbling under the weight of genuine, unbending loyalty. He realized he held no leverage. He swallowed hard, adjusting the collar of his pastel shirt, and quickly walked out into the glaring sunlight without another word. David watched him get into his luxury sedan and speed away, spinning gravel tires in a desperate attempt to salvage his pride. Sitting in my own car across town, I finally saw David's name flash across my phone screen. I answered immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He is gone," David said, his voice returning to its normal steady cadence. I threw him out. "Are you okay?" I exhaled a long, shaky breath, leaving my lungs. The knowledge that my father had actively tried to destroy my marriage should have broken me. Instead, David's unwavering defense acted as a steel beam reinforcing my spine. I was not alone. They had tried their best to sever my support system, and they had failed. "I am coming home," I told him. I grabbed the keys, turning the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I drove back to our house with a clear, singular focus. My mother had poisoned the church. My father had tried to poison my marriage. They were fighting a war of emotion, reputation, and gossip. I was going to fight a war of data. I walked through the front door, bypassing the kitchen and heading straight up the stairs to my home office. The dual monitors were still glowing, casting their pale blue light across the dark wood of the desk. I sat down in my leather chair, pulling the keyboard toward me. During the grocery store ambush and the garage confrontation, my expedited financial request had been processing in the background. The encrypted banking portal required dual authentication to release confidential check images. I picked up my phone, waiting for the secure token ping. A text message arrived carrying a 6-digit numerical code. I typed the numbers into the empty field on the screen and pressed the Enter key. The loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the screen refreshed. The digital images downloaded into my secure folder. I opened the primary file. A high-resolution scan of the front and back of the $25,000 check appeared on the monitor. The front of the document displayed the official Oak Creek Fellowship Benevolent Fund logo. It was made out to Emily Miller, listing my exact home address. The date printed on the corner matched the week following my miscarriage. I dragged my mouse and clicked to flip the image to the endorsement side. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. Written on the signature line in a looping cursive script that barely resembled my own handwriting was my forged name. But that was not the anomaly that made the breath catch in my throat. It was the 9-digit bank routing number printed beneath the signature stamped by the receiving institution upon deposit. I recognized those specific digits. I had seen them before, on a joint tax return I helped my sister file 2 years ago. The routing number receiving the stolen charity money did not belong to my mother. It belonged to a joint checking account owned by Sarah and Bradley. The 9-digit routing number printed on the back of the endorsed check glowed against the pale blue light of my computer monitor. I leaned closer to the screen, the silence of my home office pressing against my eardrums. In forensic accounting, numbers are a language. They tell a story when the people involved refuse to speak the truth. A routing number identifies the specific financial institution where a transaction is processed. The account number following it identifies the exact destination of the funds. I recognized the sequence of digits stamped beneath the forged signature. 2 years ago, my sister Sarah brought her taxes to me. Her husband, Bradley, had claimed a complicated capital loss on a commercial property, and they needed my expertise to avoid an audit. I spent 3 weeks untangling their finances. I memorized their primary banking details in the process. The routing number receiving the stolen church charity money belonged to a regional credit union. It was the exact institution holding Sarah and Bradley joint checking account. I clicked the zoom tool on my software, enlarging the endorsement line on the back of the check. The faint pixelated blue ink of the forged signature, digitized on the scan, filled my screen. The person who signed my name had tried to mimic my handwriting. The loop of the letter E was too round. The sharp angles of the M were hesitant, lacking the swift practice motion of my actual signature. My mother had forged my name. Or perhaps Sarah had. It did not matter. They were operating together. I sat back in my leather chair. The cold air conditioning vent above my desk blew a steady stream of air across my face, but I felt a burning heat rising in my chest. $25,000. The amount was not random. It was highly specific. Bradley is a commercial real estate broker. He wears custom suits and drives a luxury vehicle. But men in his profession are often heavily leveraged. Their liquid cash is frequently tied up in escrow or investments. Sarah had been bragging for months about the sprawling, custom-built residential property they had just purchased in a gated community. She constantly complained about the exorbitant closing costs and the sudden, unexpected down payment requirements the builder demanded for premium upgrades. The math clicked into place, locking the horrifying picture together. Sarah and Bradley needed a sudden infusion of cash to close on their dream home. They were short on liquid assets. My mother, desperate to maintain the facade of the golden child perfect life, decided to bail them out. But Barbara did not use her own wealth. She used the Oak Creek Fellowship Benevolent Fund. The realization hit me with the crushing weight of a falling boulder. My mother had embezzled church funds meant for the desperate, the sick, and the needy. The realization hit me with the crushing weight of a falling boulder. My mother had embezzled church funds meant for the desperate, the sick, and the needy. She used my painful, dismissed miscarriage as the emotional cover story to bypass the standard committee voting protocols. She drafted a tragic narrative about my crushing medical debt, pulled a massive charity payout, forged my signature, and funneled the cash directly to Sarah to pay for her new house. My miscarriage was not just an inconvenience to my family, it was a financial asset.
Barbara monetized my empty womb. She turned the darkest, most agonizing physical loss of my life into a real estate transaction for my sister. And to ensure she got away with it, she went to the pastor and the congregation, painting me as a delusional, hysterical woman. She knew that if I ever discovered the stolen funds and tried to expose her, the church board would dismiss my claims as the paranoid ravings of a grieving lunatic. It was a preemptive strike designed to destroy my credibility before I even knew a crime had been committed. If you have ever realized that the toxic dynamic in your family is not just dysfunctional, but actually criminal, drop the word receipts in the comments. I read every single one. I picked up a pen and a yellow legal pad. The grieving daughter was gone. The forensic auditor took the wheel. I began charting the paper trail. I had the IRS tax form proving the money was dispersed under my Social Security number. I had the digital check scan proving the forgery. I had the routing data proving the final destination of the stolen cash. But in the realm of financial fraud, digital images are often brushed aside by defensive organizations. A church board facing a massive scandal will hire defense attorneys who will argue that digital scans can be altered or misinterpreted. They will protect the institution first and the truth second. To make this evidence bulletproof, I needed the source document. I needed the internal record proving Barbara orchestrated the lie from the very beginning. I needed the master ledger. Before Barbara married my father and became a society wife, she worked as a bookkeeper for a local hardware distributor. She is 62 years old and fundamentally distrusts cloud servers and digital accounting software. She manages the Oak Creek Fellowship Benevolent Fund using a dual entry system. She inputs the final numbers into the church computer, but she tracks every single initial request, approval, and payout in a physical leather-bound ledger. She keeps that ledger in her home office, locked in the bottom drawer of her cherry wood desk. If I could secure that physical book, or at least obtain high-definition photographs of the fraudulent entry written in her own handwriting, her empire of lies would collapse. The ledger would prove she knowingly authorized the funds under false pretenses. It would be the final nail in the coffin. The problem was access. My parents' brick colonial in Vestavia Hills is a fortress. I was currently estranged, banished, and viewed as an unstable threat. My father had just tried to orchestrate my divorce. My mother had just tried to break into my nursery. I could not simply knock on the front door and ask to use the restroom. If I stepped foot on their property without a valid reason, Richard would not hesitate to call the local police and have me arrested for trespassing, which would only cement the narrative that I was losing my mind. I needed an invitation. I needed an event that would bring me inside that house when Barbara was too distracted to guard her office. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the window overlooking our driveway. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the pavement. I watched the postal worker pull up to our mailbox, deposit a stack of letters, and drive away. I walked downstairs and opened the front door. The suffocating humidity had broken, leaving a stagnant, heavy heat in its wake. I opened the brass mailbox and pulled out the delivery. Sitting on top of the utility bills and supermarket coupons was a square envelope. It was crafted from heavy textured cardstock, the kind used for formal announcements. The return address belonged to my mother. I slid my index finger under the flap, tearing the thick paper open. Inside was an invitation printed in elegant, sweeping calligraphy. You are cordially invited to celebrate the upcoming arrival of baby Miller, a lavish baby shower honoring Sarah and Bradley, hosted at the Vestavia Hills residence. The date on the invitation was exactly 2 weeks away. It was a mandated family summons. Barbara did not send this out of a genuine desire for my presence. She sent it because in her pristine social circle, a sister missing a baby shower raises uncomfortable questions. She needed me there to play the role of the supportive, quiet sibling. She expected me to sit in the corner, swallow my pride, and watch Sarah unwrap expensive gifts while the church ladies whispered about my mental state. She expected me to submit. I stared at the elegant calligraphy. The paper felt heavy in my hand. Going to that shower meant walking willingly into the lion den. It meant enduring hours of passive-aggressive comments, watching my sister flaunt her pregnancy, and listening to my mother receive praise for her beautiful family. It meant subjecting myself to the ultimate emotional torture. But the house would be packed. 30 or 40 women from Oak Creek Fellowship would be drinking mimosas in the living room, laughing, eating catered food, and demanding my mother attention. The catering staff would be rushing through the kitchen. The sheer volume of guests would create a chaotic, noisy environment. The cherry wood desk in the home office would be completely unguarded. I walked back into the house, placing the square invitation onto the kitchen counter. I did not throw it away. I picked up a magnet and pinned the card to the front of the stainless steel refrigerator. I looked at the date. I was going to attend the shower. I was going to buy a gift. I was going to wear a smile. And while they were all distracted by the golden child, I was going to walk down the hallway and secure the ledger that would destroy them all. The drive to Vestavia Hills took 22 minutes. I drove alone. Baby showers in my mother's social circle were strictly women-only events, which meant David had to stay behind. He kissed my forehead before I left, telling me to get the data and get out. I treated the afternoon not as a family gathering, but as a hostile field audit. I wore a tailored beige linen dress, flat shoes, and carried a large leather tote bag, the perfect camouflage for a woman pretending to blend into the background. I parked 3 blocks away from the brick colonial. The street was lined with luxury SUVs and imported sedans. Barbara had clearly invited every female member of the Oak Creek Fellowship Advisory Board. I walked up the manicured concrete path. A towering arch made of pastel pink and gold balloons framed the front door. The sheer excess of the display turned my stomach. My sister was celebrating a pregnancy funded by stolen charity money, and my mother had hired a professional event planner to make sure the entire town saw it. I stepped through the front door. The foyer smelled of spun sugar, expensive vanilla candles, and roasting asparagus. A waiter in a crisp white shirt walked past carrying a silver tray of non-alcoholic mimosas. The living room was packed. Dozens of women in floral dresses stood in small clusters, their high-pitched laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. In the center of the room, sitting on an ornate wicker peacock chair, was Sarah. She wore a flowing white maternity gown designed to accentuate a bump that barely existed yet. She was holding court, surrounded by a mountain of wrapped boxes adorned with satin ribbons. I took a breath, anchoring my feet to the hardwood floor. I was walking into the lion den. To secure the truth, I had to endure the performance. I navigated the edge of the room, heading toward the gift table to drop off the small generic gift card I had purchased. Before I could reach the table, a hand clamped onto my forearm. It was Mrs. Henderson, the head usher from the church. She wore a peach cardigan and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Emily," she cooed, her voice dripping with weaponized Southern pity. "We were not sure you would be up for coming today. It takes a lot of strength to be here, considering your current struggles." I looked at her grip on my arm. "I am doing just fine," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. She patted my wrist, leaning in closer. "We are all praying for your mind to find peace, dear. Your mother has been so worried. Just remember that jealousy is a poison. You will have your own season, eventually." The words were meant to sting. They were designed to put me in my place, to remind me that everyone in this room viewed me as the broken, unstable sister. A month ago, a comment like that would have sent me running for the bathroom in tears. Today, it felt hollow. I looked at the women gossiping near the fireplace. I looked at Sarah posing for a photo. I saw them for what they truly were, a collection of easily manipulated pawns, participating in a grand financial fraud without even knowing it. "Thank you for your concern," I replied, stepping away from her grasp. I blended back into the crowd, maintaining my unbothered facade. Enduring this profound emotional abuse was the price of admission. Every condescending glance, every whispered remark behind a cocktail napkin was a necessary toll I had to pay to reach the cherrywood desk. An hour passed. The caterers cleared the luncheon plates. Barbara tapped a crystal glass with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the room. It was time for the main event, the gift opening. The women pulled their chairs into a large semicircle around Sarah. Barbara stood to the side, holding a sleek digital camera, directing the angles and the lighting. The noise level in the room spiked. Laughter, exaggerated gasps, and loud applause erupted every time Sarah tore the wrapping paper off a designer onesie or a high-end stroller accessory. This was my window. Every eye in the house was focused on the golden child. The caterers were busy in the kitchen washing dishes.
I stood near the back of the semicircle, pretending to check my phone. I took one step backward into the foyer. Nobody noticed. I took another step. I slipped around the corner, leaving the bright, chaotic living room behind. The hallway leading to the back of the house was dim and cool. The hardwood floors were covered with thick runner rugs that silenced my footsteps. I walked past the guest bathroom, past the closed doors of the guest bedrooms, heading straight for the home office at the very end of the corridor. I turned the brass knob. It clicked softly, and the heavy door swung open. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me, leaving a small crack open just in case I needed to hear approaching footsteps. The transition was jarring. The muffled sounds of women laughing and clapping in the living room filtered through the walls, a joyful, ignorant noise that contrasted sharply with the dead silence of the study. The air in the office felt heavy, smelling of old paper and furniture polish. My eyes locked onto the cherry wood desk sitting in the center of the room. I moved quickly. I did not turn on the overhead lamp, relying instead on the natural light filtering through the plantation shutters. I walked behind the desk and knelt on the carpet. Barbara was a creature of rigid habit. She always kept her most important financial documents in the bottom right drawer. I wrapped my hand around the brass drawer pull and tugged. It was locked. A brief surge of panic flared in my chest, but I pushed it down. A lock meant there was a key. My mother never kept keys on her person while hosting. She hated the bulk in her pockets. I stood up and scanned the desk. A ceramic pen holder, a leather blotter, a small decorative wooden box designed to hold paper clips. I flipped the lid of the wooden box open. Sitting beneath a pile of silver clips was a small brass key. I grabbed it, knelt back down, and slid it into the lock on the bottom drawer. It turned with a satisfying metallic click. I pulled the heavy drawer open. Inside, nestled among hanging file folders, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The spine was stamped with the current calendar year. I lifted the heavy book and placed it on the desk. My hands were remarkably steady. I opened the cover, flipping past the index. The pages were divided into neat, hand-drawn columns. Dates, recipient names, justification codes, and withdrawal amounts. I skimmed through the months, tracing my finger down the margins until I reached the week following my clinic visit. The ink was black, written in my mother's distinct looping cursive. I found the entry. The date matched the forged check. The recipient column read Emily Miller. The withdrawal amount column displayed $25,000. But it was the justification column that made my blood run cold. Barbara had written a detailed paragraph-long explanation to satisfy the church auditors. The handwritten text stated the funds were allocated to cover emergency surgical interventions and crushing debt stemming from severe miscarriage complications. She had embellished the lie, turning my quiet, devastating loss into a dramatic medical emergency that required immediate, unchecked financial relief. The sheer sociopathy of seeing my trauma weaponized in her neat handwriting took my breath away. She had sat at this very desk knowing my heart was broken and calculated exactly how much money she could extract from my pain to buy Sarah a house. I pulled my phone from my leather tote bag. I opened the camera application, turning off the flash and the shutter sound. I held the phone steady above the ledger. I took a high-resolution photograph of the entire page. Then I zoomed in and took a macro shot of the specific entry, ensuring every curve of her handwriting was perfectly legible. I took 3 more pictures from different angles just to be safe. The evidence was now bulletproof. The digital check proved the money went to Sarah, the tax form proved the money was issued under my name, and this physical ledger proved Barbara orchestrated the entire fraud, fabricating a medical emergency to raid a charity fund. I closed the leather book. I placed it back into the bottom drawer, sliding the hanging files into their exact original position. I locked the drawer, removed the brass key, and dropped it back into the wooden paperclip box. I took a deep breath, letting the smell of old paper and furniture polish ground me one last time. I had what I came for. The audit was complete. It was time to leave the lion den. I picked up my tote bag, walked to the office door, and pulled it open. I stepped out into the dim, cool hallway, my eyes adjusting to the shadows after staring at the bright phone screen. I turned to head back toward the foyer. I took one step, and my shoulder collided hard with solid flesh. I stumbled back, my heart launching into my throat. Standing directly in front of me, blocking the narrow corridor, was Barbara. She was not holding her digital camera anymore. Her arms were crossed over her chest. The muffled cheers from the living room echoed behind her, but her face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. She looked at the closed office door, and then she looked at me. "What exactly are you doing lurking in the dark?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a menacing quiet register. I stopped walking. The heavy, sweet scent of the expensive lilies arranged in a tall crystal vase on the hallway credenza choked the air in the narrow corridor. The floral aroma was thick, cloying, and suffocating, mixing with the chilling tension radiating from my mother. Through the thin walls, the muffled sounds of women laughing and clapping in the living room created a surreal, joyful soundtrack to the nightmare unfolding in the shadows. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire existence treating me as a supporting character in her theatrical production. I tightened my grip on the leather strap of my tote bag, feeling the weight of the phone resting safely inside. "What am I doing?" I echoed her question, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "I am finishing an audit." Barbara narrowed her eyes. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the digital camera in her hands. "You have no business in this part of the house," she snapped. "Get back to the living room or leave. You are making a fool of yourself sneaking around like a thief." I stayed planted on the runner rug. "I know about the benevolent fund," I said. My voice was hushed, carrying just enough volume to reach her ears over the muffled cheers echoing from the baby shower down the hall. "I know about the $25,000 you pulled from the charity account under my Social Security number." I watched her face carefully, searching for the micro-expressions that reveal guilt. The calibration was instantaneous. First a flash of genuine shock, then rapid calculation. Finally, a mask of practiced cold indifference settled over her features. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Barbara replied, her tone dripping with bored condescension. "You are letting your imagination run wild again." I refused to let her control the narrative. "I know you forged my signature on the back of the check." I continued listing the data points with the precision of a metronome. "I know you fabricated a story about crushing medical debt stemming from my miscarriage. And I know the funds were deposited directly into Sarah and Bradley joint checking account at the regional credit union. I have the receipts, Mother, all of them." The silence in the hallway deepened. The heavy scent of the lilies seemed to press into my lungs, making it difficult to inhale. I watched the realization wash over Barbara. She realized I was not guessing. I was citing federal tax codes and verified banking routes. The golden facade she had spent decades building was suddenly standing on a trapdoor, and my hand was resting on the lever. I offered her one final exit ramp, a chance to retain a shred of dignity. "I am giving you a choice." I told her, my eyes locked directly onto hers. "You are going to march into Pastor Sterling's office by Sunday morning. You are going to confess to the embezzlement. You are going to resign from the church board, and you are going to repay every single stolen dollar to that charity fund. If you do not tell him the truth by the start of the Sunday service, I will do it for you." I expected panic. I expected her to crumble, to beg, to offer a frantic excuse about helping Sarah secure her dream home. I expected the facade to shatter. Instead, Barbara laughed. It was not a loud sound. It was a soft, breathy chuckle that chilled the blood in my veins. She tilted her head, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated amusement. The corners of her mouth curled upward into a smirk that contained zero warmth. "You truly have lost your mind," Barbara whispered. Her voice carried no fear, just cold, calculating cruelty. "Do you really think anyone in that congregation will believe a single word you say? I have already laid the groundwork, Emily. The entire town knows you are suffering from a psychological break. I stood at the pulpit and asked hundreds of people to pray for your fragile mental state. Patricia Sterling thinks you are a jealous lunatic." She took a slow step closer. The expensive perfume she wore mixed with the suffocating lilies, creating a toxic cloud in the enclosed space. "If you try to speak to the pastor," she hissed, her eyes glinting in the dim light, "if you dare utter one word of this paranoid fantasy to anyone in our community, I will not just deny it, I will call the authorities. I will tell the police my unstable daughter is trespassing in my home, hallucinating financial crimes because she is obsessed with her pregnant sister. Wealthy families handle problems quietly in this town. I will have you legally institutionalized for a psychiatric evaluation faster than you can blink." The boulder dropped. The crushing realization settled over my shoulders, heavy and immovable. A toxic parent will never choose accountability. They will only choose escalation. My mother was willing to strip away my freedom, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and destroy my entire future just to protect her social reputation and fund Sarah down payment. There was no bottom to her depravity. She did not love me. She never had. She viewed me simply as a threat that needed to be neutralized. I looked into her eyes and saw nothing but a predator protecting her territory. I did not argue. I did not yell. I did not try to appeal to a maternal instinct that did not exist. I simply nodded. I adjusted the strap of my leather tote bag on my shoulder, stepped around her rigid frame, and walked down the hallway. I bypassed the living room, ignoring the laughter, the mountains of wrapping paper, and the ignorant guests. I walked straight out the front door, leaving the suffocating scent of the lilies behind me. I drove home with a singular, icy focus. I arrived at our house and found David waiting in the kitchen. He was wiping down the countertops, his presence a grounding anchor in the storm. I set my bag on the island. I pulled out my phone, opened the photo gallery, and slid the device across the granite surface. He looked at the high-resolution images of the physical ledger, his jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. He asked what my mother had said when she caught me in the corridor. I recounted the threat of involuntary institutionalization. I watched the fierce, protective anger flare in my husband's eyes. He pulled me close, wrapping his strong arms around my waist, resting his chin on the top of my head. He promised me that nobody was ever going to lock me away. We spent the next 48 hours preparing for war. I did not sleep. I sat at my home office desk, turning raw data into an undeniable prosecution file. I printed the official IRS tax form. I printed the digital check scans displaying the forged signature and the matching routing numbers. I printed the stark photographs of the handwritten ledger entry, ensuring every curve of Barbara looping cursive was perfectly legible. I organized the documents into a clear chronological timeline of fraud. I highlighted the date of my miscarriage. I highlighted the date the funds were requested. I highlighted the date the money settled into my sister account. I placed every single page inside a thick manila envelope and sealed the metal clasp. I was no longer a grieving daughter seeking an apology. I was a forensic auditor delivering a final verdict. The weekend faded into Sunday morning. The alarm clock buzzed at 6 o'clock sharp. The Alabama sky was painted in bruised shades of purple and gray, promising a sweltering, oppressive heat wave by noon. I walked into my closet. I bypassed the modest navy dress I had worn during my public humiliation 2 weeks prior. I was not going to shrink into the pews today. I reached for a tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the exact armor I wore when I deposed hostile witnesses in corporate embezzlement trials. It projected authority, competence, and unyielding strength. I buttoned the blazer. I secured my hair into a tight professional knot at the base of my neck. I applied minimal makeup, leaving my face sharp and severe. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The hollow, terrified woman who had sat frozen in exam room 4 was gone. The frightened daughter who dropped her napkin at the Sunday dinner table had vanished. Staring back at me was a woman holding a lit match, standing in front of an empire of lies, ready to burn it to the ground. David stood in the bedroom doorway. He wore his dark tailored suit, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his presence a silent pillar of unwavering support. He held the thick manila envelope in his right hand. He walked forward and offered it to me. I took it, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the paper inside. It was time to go to church. We walked out the front door and got into the car. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet morning air. The point of no return had arrived. The parking lot of Oak Creek Fellowship was a sea of imported luxury vehicles and polished sedans. The morning heat radiated off the black asphalt, creating shimmering waves of distortion in the distance. David parked our car near the back of the lot. He turned off the ignition, and the sudden quiet in the cabin felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. The thick manila envelope rested on my lap, its metal clasp cold against my fingertips. I ran my thumb over the smooth paper, anchoring myself to the data contained inside.
We stepped out into the oppressive humidity and walked toward the towering glass entrance. Greeters stationed at the double doors offered practiced bright smiles that faltered the second they recognized my face. The young man handing out glossy Sunday bulletins paused, his hand freezing in midair, his eyes darting away in profound discomfort. I did not take a bulletin. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, stepping over the threshold into the frigid, air-conditioned sanctuary lobby. Oak Creek Fellowship was not just a place of worship. It was a carefully managed corporate entity. Pastor Sterling and his wife Patricia built this congregation from a tiny strip mall storefront 3 decades ago. They achieved their current elite status by prioritizing flawless optics, prosperity, and strict order. A public scandal was their ultimate enemy. Patricia treated the advisory board like a corporate executive committee, meticulously vetting every family allowed into their inner circle. Barbara bought her way into that exclusive tier through relentless fundraising and projecting an image of the perfect Southern matriarch. My presence today, wearing a tailored charcoal suit instead of a submissive floral dress, was a direct threat to that curated perfection. The sanctuary was already packed. 800 people sat in the curved rows of theater-style seating that transitioned into rigid wooden pews near the front stage. The worship band stood on the elevated platform bathed in soft blue and purple lighting, playing a slow acoustic introductory song. David placed his hand on the small of my back. We did not head for the obscure, shadowed rows near the rear exits. We walked straight down the wide center aisle. The reaction was immediate. A low, continuous murmur rippled through the congregation as we passed each row. Heads turned, shoulders shifted. The women who had heard my mother tell tearful tales of my psychological break leaned into their husbands, whispering behind manicured hands. They expected me to look broken. They expected erratic behavior, disheveled hair, and downcast eyes. Instead, I walked with the measured, lethal precision of an auditor entering a hostile boardroom. Barbara always sat in the exact same location every Sunday. Row 3, center aisle, left side. Prime real estate for maximum visibility. Patricia Sterling sat right beside her, their physical proximity broadcasting their united social power. Sarah and Bradley were notably absent, likely resting after the extravagant exertions of the baby shower. I reached the 4th row. I stepped into the aisle and took the seat directly behind my mother. David sat down beside me, his broad shoulders shielding my flank. The physical distance between Barbara and me was less than 2 feet. I could smell the lingering trace of her expensive floral perfume, the same scent that had suffocated the hallway of her home less than 24 hours ago. She wore an emerald green silk dress, her hair sprayed into an immaculate, unmoving style. She felt our arrival. The subtle shift in air currents, the sudden hush from the rows behind her, alerted her to my presence. Barbara stiffened, her shoulders locked into a rigid defensive posture. She did not turn around to acknowledge me. To look back would be a concession of power. She kept her eyes glued to the stage, pretending she was entirely unbothered by the daughter she had threatened to institutionalize. Patricia sat equally stiff, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her silver cross necklace catching the stage lights. The tension radiating from the row ahead of me was thick enough to cut with a knife. I leaned back against the pew. The rigid mahogany wood dug sharply into my spine, pressing hard against my vertebrae. The unforgiving surface offered zero comfort, but the physical discomfort was exactly what I needed. It grounded me in the present reality, preventing my mind from spiraling into the emotional gravity of what I was about to do. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I held the manila envelope flat on my lap, my hands resting lightly on top of the sealed flap. The worship band finished their final chord. The sound of the acoustic guitar faded into the carpeted floorboards, leaving a resonant, expectant silence in the enormous room. The stage lights shifted from blue to a warm, bright white. Pastor Sterling walked up the side steps, carrying his leather-bound notes, heading toward the clear acrylic podium. The congregation rustled, settling into their seats, preparing for the morning announcements. In that brief, quiet lull before the microphone was switched on, Barbara leaned slightly to her right. She closed the distance between herself and Patricia. She believed the ambient rustling of 800 people shifting in their seats would mask her voice. She underestimated the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling, and she underestimated how closely I was listening. I heard the whisper clear as day. The words drifted over the back of the mahogany pew, sharp and distinct. She is lying for sympathy. She was never even pregnant. The words hit the air and hung there, toxic and undeniable. Any lingering microscopic shred of doubt I held about my course of action evaporated in that exact second. The finality of my mother cruelty settled over me like a heavy winter coat. She was not just trying to cover up a financial crime to protect Sarah. She was actively, continually rewriting my tragedy to bond with Patricia over shared gossip. She was using the erasure of my unborn child as social currency to solidify her own victimhood. She would never stop. She would never apologize. She would spend the rest of her life harvesting my pain to feed her own vanity. I did not shrink. The final remnants of the obedient, silent daughter burned away, leaving nothing but cold, refined steel. I looked to my left. David was staring at the back of Barbara, had his jaw clenched so tight the muscles ticked beneath his skin. He had heard the whisper too. I met his eyes. I did not need to speak. I raised my eyebrows, a silent question, asking if he was ready for the fallout. David looked at me. His expression was a fortress of unyielding support. He offered one single firm nod. I placed my hand on the smooth, polished edge of the wooden pew in front of me. I pushed myself up. I stood tall, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer, ensuring every line of my armor was flawless. I picked up the thick manila envelope. The ambient music playing softly from the overhead speakers faded into total silence. Pastor Sterling reached the podium and tapped the microphone, drawing the attention of the entire room to the front. I took a step sideways. I cleared the wooden pew and stepped out into the wide-carpeted main aisle. As I moved into the open space, the motion caught the periphery of the crowd. The eyes of 800 people shifted away from the stage, locking entirely onto me. The sanctuary of Oak Creek Fellowship held 800 people, yet in the span of a single heartbeat, the sprawling room felt devoid of oxygen. I stepped out from the fourth row and planted my low heels onto the plush burgundy carpet of the center aisle. The thick fabric absorbed my footsteps, but the visual impact of my movement severed the expected flow of the Sunday service. Pastor Sterling stood at the acrylic podium, his mouth parted, a welcoming script dying on his tongue. He gripped the polished edges of the clear stand, uncertain how to process a congregant breaking the rigid choreography of his domain. Every head in the room turned. The collective rustle of silk dresses, tailored suits, and shifting weight echoed like a dry wind sweeping through a narrow canyon. These were the exact people who had bowed their heads 2 weeks prior, praying for my psychiatric confinement. They looked at me, expecting to see a shattered, hysterical woman unraveling in real time. They anticipated tears, smeared makeup, and a frantic plea for validation. Instead, they saw a forensic accountant wearing a charcoal blazer, standing with the unyielding posture of a judge entering a hostile courtroom. I did not cast my eyes downward. I did not tremble. I held my chin level, meeting the gaze of anyone brave enough to look directly at me. Barbara realized something was wrong a fraction of a second after the crowd quieted. The sudden shift in ambient attention prompted her to turn around. Her immaculate emerald green silk dress rustled sharply as she twisted in the mahogany pew. She expected to see a minor disruption in the back lobby, perhaps a crying infant or a dropped hymnal. Instead, she found her eldest daughter standing less than 3 feet away, holding a thick manila envelope. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her face a pale, ghostly white beneath her perfectly applied blush. The panic in my mother's eyes was not born of maternal concern. It was the stark, raw terror of an apex predator realizing she was suddenly trapped in a cage of her own making. She reached out her manicured hand, darting toward my forearm, a desperate attempt to drag me back into the shadows of the seating row. "Emily, sit down right now," she hissed. Her voice was a strained, breathy command barely audible over the hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. "You are making a fool of yourself." I did not pull my arm away because she never made contact. I simply stepped out of her reach, shifting my trajectory forward. I bypassed her entirely. I left her sitting next to Patricia, her hand grasping at empty air. Walking past Barbara was a physical manifestation of breaking a 30-year chain. For my entire life, she had dictated my movements, my worth, and my reality. She had controlled the narrative, painting herself as the selfless matriarch and me as the problematic burden. Taking that step forward without asking for her permission or fearing her wrath was the most terrifying and liberating action I had ever taken. I left the architect of my misery behind me in the pews, stranded in her own deceit. I continued down the center aisle, closing the distance between the congregation seating and the elevated stage. The bright, warm wash lights beamed down from the ceiling trusses, illuminating the fine dust particles dancing in the air. The silence in the room stretched, growing heavier with every inch I covered. Nobody moved to stop me. The volunteer ushers stood frozen at their posts against the side walls, their walkie-talkies silent on their hips. The sheer audacity of a woman walking calmly toward the pulpit during the sacred morning announcements paralyzed the entire building. I caught sight of Mrs. Henderson in the second row. The woman who had offered me weaponized pity at the baby shower now stared at me with her jaw unhinged, clutching her leather purse to her chest as if I were carrying a weapon. I was carrying a weapon, but it was forged from data, not steel. The envelope in my hands contained the irrefutable proof of a federal financial crime. It held the IRS tax form, the digital check scans displaying the forged signature, the routing numbers tracing the stolen charity cash to my sister, and the stark photographs of the handwritten ledger entry. I reached the base of the carpeted stairs leading up to the platform. Pastor Sterling recovered a fraction of his pastoral composure. He stepped out from behind the clear acrylic podium, his silver microphone clipped securely to the lapel of his navy suit. He extended one hand toward me, palm facing downward, a universal gesture meant to pacify and control. "Emily," he said, his deep baritone, carrying smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system, "we are so glad you joined us today, but this is not the appropriate time for a personal testimony. Let us find a quiet space after the service to pray over your troubled heart." He used his soothing, authoritative tone, the specific cadence designed to de-escalate erratic behavior. He was treating me like a volatile element that needed to be contained to protect the pristine optics of his Sunday broadcast. He wanted to usher me into a back room where the truth could be smothered in platitudes and hushed prayers. I did not halt my momentum. I climbed the 3 short steps onto the stage. My low heels clicked softly against the wooden platform. I stood on the elevated surface, sharing the spotlight with the man who had broadcasted my supposed insanity to the entire county. I turned my body slightly, allowing the 800 congregants to see my profile. This was the exact audience my mother had weaponized to destroy my credibility. She had used these people as a shield, believing their collective judgment would keep me silent forever. By standing in front of them, bathed in the stage lights, I was reclaiming the narrative. I was forcing them to witness the truth in the very room where the lies were born. Enduring the profound emotional abuse of the past few weeks had galvanized my resolve. I looked at Pastor Sterling. I did not shed a single tear. My face remained a mask of cool, objective certainty. I lifted the thick manila envelope and held it out toward him. He looked at the brown paper, hesitation flickering across his distinguished features. The congregation watched with bated breath, the tension pulling tight like a piano wire ready to snap. He had no choice but to take it. To refuse a congregant on the main stage would look callous on the live stream cameras mounted in the balcony. He reached out and grasped the edge of the envelope. I did not let go immediately. I held his gaze, ensuring he understood the gravity of the transaction. Then I released the paper. Pastor Sterling looked down at his hands. He hooked his thumb under the small circular metal clasp securing the top flap. He pulled it upward. The sharp metallic pop of the brass prongs bending backward echoed through the lapel microphone clipped to his chest. The tiny sound amplified through the line array speakers hanging from the ceiling, ringing out across the silent sanctuary like a gunshot. It was a crisp mechanical noise that signaled the end of an era. I stood tall on the edge of the stage, my posture unyielding, silently daring anyone in the room to look away from the reckoning. The top document resting inside the folder was the certified fetal death certificate. I had placed it there deliberately. Before introducing the financial ledgers, the routing numbers, or the evidence of embezzlement, I needed the pastor to confront the undeniable medical reality of my loss. The state-issued seal stamped on the paper proved that the child my mother called a phantom delusion had existed, had died, and had been legally recorded. It was the ultimate, irrefutable defense of my sanity. I glanced down at the fourth row. David remained seated, his posture relaxed but hypervigilant. He was the only person in the massive room who was not holding his breath. He watched the pastor handle the envelope, knowing exactly what was written on those pages. His presence anchored me. My father had tried to force David to abandon me, hoping to isolate me from my only source of strength. Instead, his unwavering loyalty gave me the courage to stand under these bright lights and dismantle my mother empire. Pastor Sterling slid his fingers inside the opening, grasping the thick stack of printed documents I had prepared. He pulled the papers free from the brown casing. The bright stage lights illuminated the stark white pages. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, tilting his head to read the top sheet. His eyes scanned the first paragraph, moving rapidly back and forth across the text. Within 3 seconds, the practiced pastoral warmth melted off his face. The color entirely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. Pastor Sterling stared at the top sheet of paper. The harsh stage lighting illuminated the official state seal embossed on the bottom corner of the fetal death certificate. For a man who built his career on managing optics and maintaining a serene environment, the sheer, undeniable reality of a legal medical document short-circuited his brain. He had stood on this very stage 2 weeks ago, leading a prayer that dismissed my child as a psychological delusion. Now the physical proof of that child existed right in his grip. I watched the flutter of the certified paper trembling in the pastor's shaking hand. The thin sheet vibrated with the rapid, uneven rhythm of his pulse. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing above his crisp white collar, processing the catastrophic failure of his own judgment. He slid the certificate to the back of the stack, exposing the next document. The IRS tax form clearly displayed my Social Security number and the disbursement code for the crisis grant. His eyes darted to the high-resolution digital scan of the forged check. I had highlighted the routing numbers printed beneath the fraudulent signature. He recognized the bank details. As the senior pastor, he signed off on the payroll accounts and understood the mechanics of financial routing. Finally, he reached the stark color photograph of the handwritten leather-bound ledger. The looping cursive ink matched the handwriting of the woman who sat in his advisory meetings every Tuesday morning. The timeline of the fraud materialized before his eyes in chronological order. Forensic accounting is designed to remove emotion and present a linear sequence of undeniable facts. The sequence hit the pastor with the force of a freight train. He slowly lowered the stack of papers. He did not look at me. He lifted his gaze and stared directly out into the third row, locking his eyes onto Barbara. The betrayal etched into his features was profound. My mother was not just a congregant, she was the treasurer of his most sacred charity fund, a woman he had trusted to handle the most vulnerable operations of his church. The silence in the immense room grew so tight it felt like the air pressure was dropping. Pastor Sterling leaned closer to the acrylic podium. He brought his mouth inches away from the lapel microphone clipped to his suit jacket. His voice trembled, losing its polished theatrical resonance, replaced by the raw, unsteady tone of a man confronting a nightmare. "Ma'am, this is a certified fetal death certificate and a cleared check from this church crisis fund to your daughter Sarah for $25,000. The sentence broadcasted through the line array speakers, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crashing into the audience. For 2 agonizing seconds, the sanctuary remained suspended in a breathless vacuum. Then the dam broke. The congregation erupted into pure chaos. The low, polite murmurs morphed into a frantic wave of gasps, angry shouts, and bewildered whispering. 800 people simultaneously comprehended the depth of the deception. The benevolent fund was financed by their tithes, their weekly offerings, and their personal sacrifices. They had donated that money to help families facing evictions and medical bankruptcies. Learning that their hard-earned charity had been siphoned off to fund a luxury real estate purchase for a wealthy broker wife ignited a fierce collective outrage. The polished, orderly megachurch transformed into a hostile arena in the blink of an eye. Down in the second row, Mrs. Henderson dropped her leather purse. The contents spilled across the carpet, but she did not bend down to retrieve her belongings. She simply stared at the third row, her face twisting in disgust. The women who had gossiped about my mental state, who had shunned me in the grocery store and iced me out of their social circles, now turned their collective fury onto the true architect of the scandal. Patricia Sterling sat next to my mother. The pastor wife turned her head slowly, staring at Barbara as if sitting beside a venomous predator. The woman who had cornered me in the produce aisle, accusing me of fabricating a tragedy to steal my sister Joy, now looked at the mastermind of the fraud. Patricia recoiled, pressing her back against the mahogany pew, physically distancing herself from the toxicity. Barbara saw the shift. She felt the sudden freezing withdrawal of her social armor. The golden empire of lies she had meticulously constructed over 3 decades collapsed in real time. The flawless Southern matriarch persona dissolved, revealing the frantic, cornered narcissist underneath. Barbara leaped to her feet. The sudden jerky movement caused her expensive emerald silk dress to catch on the wooden armrest. She ignored the tearing fabric, her face twisting into a mask of pure desperation. The illusion of her perfect family was shattering on the largest stage possible, and she possessed no tools to fix it. "Those are fake!" Barbara screamed, her voice cracking, devoid of its usual measured melodic tone. She pointed a trembling finger at the pulpit, her eyes wild with panic. "My daughter printed those on a computer. She is a sick, jealous liar. Do not look at those papers. She is trying to ruin this family because she cannot handle her own failures." Her frantic denials fell on deaf ears. The undeniable legal truth was laid bare on the stage held by the ultimate authority figure of their community. When Pastor Sterling did not immediately drop the documents, Barbara decided to take them by force. She shoved her way out of the pew, knocking her designer handbag to the floor. She stomped into the center aisle, lowering her shoulder, preparing to rush the carpeted steps and physically rip the manila envelope from the pastor's hands. She intended to shred the evidence right in front of the congregation. She took 2 rapid steps forward. She did not take a third. David stepped out from the 4th row. He moved with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a man who spent his life fixing broken machinery and protecting the things he loved. He squared his broad shoulders, planting his leather dress shoes firmly onto the center of the aisle runner. He did not raise his hands. He did not assume a fighting stance. He simply became an immovable wall of solid muscle and unyielding loyalty, blocking her path entirely. Barbara collided with his chest, bouncing off his suit jacket like a bird hitting a glass window. She stumbled backward, her low heels skidding against the plush carpet. "Move out of my way, you mechanic!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the rising din of the outraged congregation. David did not flinch. He looked down at his mother-in-law with an expression of profound, icy disgust. "You are not going anywhere near my wife," David stated. His voice was low, but it carried the raw, intimidating resonance of a finalized verdict. The physical barrier he provided gave me the exact space I needed to stand tall on the stage watching the ruins of my abuser kingdom fall. The ushers stationed at the side doors finally snapped out of their shock. They began moving down the aisles, their walkie-talkies crackling to life as they called for the off-duty police officers assigned to traffic control. The conflict was no longer a private family dispute. It had evolved into a documented financial crime unfolding in a public venue. The board of directors seated in the front rows began standing up, their faces grim and serious. I remained on the elevated platform looking down at the chaos I had engineered through pure, unadulterated facts. Barbara was trapped in the aisle, pacing like a caged animal, screaming insults at David, while the congregation jeered at her. Pastor Sterling stood frozen at the pulpit, clutching the forged check and the death certificate, realizing the pristine reputation of his megachurch was permanently stained by his own failure to verify the truth. The spotlight illuminated the dust motes swirling around me, highlighting the exact moment the burden of shame transferred from my shoulders onto theirs. The sanctuary descended into a chaotic roar. Pastor Sterling raised his hand, gesturing frantically to the sound booth located in the upper balcony. The main speakers cut out with a sharp pop, plunging the stage into unamplified confusion. 3 senior members of the church advisory board rushed down the side aisles, their faces grim, intercepting the pastor before he could hand the manila envelope back to me. A retired municipal judge named Davis snatched the documents from Sterling. Davis put on his reading glasses, scanned the forged check, and looked directly at Barbara. I did not wait for the impromptu interrogation to conclude. I turned my back on the pulpit and walked down the carpeted stairs. David was waiting for me at the bottom step. He offered his arm, a steady, solid anchor in the middle of a collapsing room. We linked arms and began our walk back up the center aisle. Richard finally broke his paralyzed silence. He shoved past a group of panicked ushers, his face a mottled purple shade. "Emily," he bellowed, his voice raw and echoing off the stained glass windows. "You get back here right now. You are destroying your mother." I kept my eyes fixed on the glass exit doors. I did not turn my head. David adjusted his pace to match mine, interposing his broad frame between me and the grasping hands of former friends who suddenly wanted to offer frantic, confused questions. We pushed through the heavy wooden lobby doors and stepped out into the blazing Alabama sunlight. My phone buzzed in my purse as we crossed the asphalt parking lot. Sarah was calling. The gossip mill had already reached her upscale neighborhood. She called 3 times in rapid succession, followed by a barrage of frantic text messages demanding to know what I had done to our parents. I silenced the device. Over the next 30 days, the meticulous prosecution file I delivered to the church board triggered a devastating chain reaction. The truth, when backed by irrefutable data, is a relentless force. You can gaslight a grieving daughter. You can manipulate a congregation. You cannot gaslight a federal bank investigator. The church advisory board held an emergency session that same Sunday afternoon. Faced with a certified death certificate and glaring evidence of wire fraud, they had zero room to maneuver. To protect their tax-exempt status and shield the megachurch from liability, they immediately suspended Barbara from all administrative duties. By Tuesday morning, the church retained outside legal counsel and handed my manila envelope over to the local authorities. The Police Department Financial Crimes Division opened a formal investigation. Barbara was officially charged with embezzlement, grand larceny, and forgery. The Vestavia Hills social scene is a brutal ecosystem built entirely on proximity to power and pristine optics. The moment the marked police cruisers parked in my parents' driveway to execute a search warrant for the physical leather-bound ledger Barbara was vaporized from the social registry. The women who used to vie for her attention at garden parties suddenly claimed they barely knew her. Her country club membership was quietly revoked. She became a pariah in her own kingdom, trapped in her brick colonial, while defense attorneys drained her retirement accounts. But the most spectacular implosion occurred across town, inside the gated community where my sister believed she was untouchable. Sarah had always relied on our mother to smooth over her mistakes and fund her extravagant lifestyle. When the stolen $25,000 landed in her joint checking account, Sarah told her husband it was an early inheritance gift from Barbara. Bradley never questioned the sudden influx of cash because it served his immediate needs. He used the money to close the escrow on their custom-built residential property. The illusion of their flawless marriage shattered the moment the regional credit union complied with a police subpoena. The fraud investigators froze Sarah and Bradley joint accounts to recover the stolen charity funds. Bradley is a commercial real estate broker. His entire career hinges on his financial credibility and his state-issued licensing. Discovering that his wife and mother-in-law had funneled embezzled church money through his personal bank account put him in direct legal jeopardy. Bradley did not offer Sarah loyalty. He did not offer grace. He operated with the exact same ruthless self-preservation that my family had always championed. He hired a vicious divorce attorney to protect his commercial assets and distance himself from the criminal fallout. He packed his custom suits and moved into a downtown hotel, leaving a pregnant Sarah entirely alone in an empty mansion she had no means to afford. Within 3 weeks, the mortgage went into default. The builder threatened pre-foreclosure. Sarah flooded my phone with desperate voicemails begging me to withdraw the allegations, pleading for financial rescue. She demanded I fix the mess I had created. She still believed I was the administrative support staff existing only to clean up her wreckage. I blocked her number. The town that had eagerly participated in my public shaming suddenly found itself standing on the wrong side of a documented felony. The same congregants who had stared at me with pity and disgust in the grocery store aisles now scrambled to rewrite their own complicity. They realized they had mocked a grieving mother and protected a thief. The apologies began arriving by the end of the first week. I sat at my kitchen island on a quiet Thursday evening. David was in the living room reading a book, The House, peaceful and secure. I placed my cell phone on the granite counter, the screen illuminated, displaying a bright red notification icon, indicating I had 27 unheard voicemails. I tapped the screen to open the visual voicemail log. The names listed were a roster of the hypocrites who had shunned me. Patricia Sterling, Mrs. Henderson, the women from my former Bible study, the neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid walking past my driveway. I pressed play on the first message. It was Patricia. Emily, her voice wavered, dripping with a newly manufactured saccharine sweetness. We are just devastated by the truth coming to light. The pastor and I had no idea your mother was capable of such deception. We want to invite you and David over for dinner to properly apologize and welcome you back into the fold. I stared at the digital playback bar moving across the screen. I did not feel a sense of triumph. I did not feel vindicated by her groveling. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound exhaustion regarding these hollow people. They were not apologizing because they felt genuine remorse for treating my dead child like a punchline. They were apologizing because they were embarrassed they got caught backing the losing horse. They wanted to welcome me back into a toxic system that requires women to perform their pain for public consumption. They wanted everything to return to a polite, manageable status quo. That is the ultimate validation of realizing your own worth. When you finally force your abusers to look at the undeniable truth, you realize their acceptance was never actually valuable to begin with. Truth backed by data cannot be gaslit. The math had exonerated me, but I no longer wanted a seat at their table. I tapped the screen and deleted Patricia's message before she even finished her sentence. I moved down the list, Mrs. Henderson offering a tearful excuse about being misled. Delete. A neighbor claiming she always knew something was wrong with Barbara. Delete. A church elder asking if I would be willing to issue a public statement of forgiveness to help the congregation heal. Delete. I did not listen to a single excuse. I dragged my finger across the screen, selecting every single voicemail in the inbox. I pressed the red trash can icon at the bottom of the interface. The phone screen cleared, leaving a perfectly blank, quiet inbox. I set the device face down on the granite counter. The silence in the kitchen was beautiful. It was not the cold, oppressive silence of keeping a secret. It was the warm, expansive silence of a life scrubbed clean of parasites. David walked into the kitchen, placing a hand on my shoulder. He looked at the phone, then looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs easily for the first time in months. The legal gears were turning, dismantling the people who had tried to bury me. My mother was facing a judge. My sister was facing ruin. My father was facing the total collapse of his pristine social standing. I did not need to lift another finger. The math was finally balancing itself out, exactly the way it always does when you expose the hidden variables. I looked at my husband, preparing for the final phase of building a future they could never touch. 6 months passed. The suffocating, oppressive Alabama summer finally broke, surrendering to a crisp, clear winter. The change in the season mirrored the profound shift inside my own life. The chaotic noise of the Vestavia Hills social elite faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. I instituted a strict, impenetrable zero-contact rule with my parents and my sister the very afternoon we walked out of the church sanctuary. I did not issue a warning. I did not send a final dramatic letter. I simply severed the connection, changing our phone numbers, upgrading our home security, and directing all related correspondence to a hired attorney. The legal system took control of the wreckage, operating with cold, unforgiving efficiency. Barbara pleaded not guilty during her initial arraignment, clinging to her delusion of superiority. But the physical ledger provided by the search warrant shattered her defense. The handwritten notes detailing the fabricated medical emergency offered undeniable proof of intent. She is currently awaiting sentencing for felony wire fraud. Richard stepped down from his executive firm, forced into an early, disgraced retirement because his wealthy clients refused to associate with a public scandal. Sarah finalized a bitter divorce, losing the custom-built mansion to the bank, left to navigate the consequences of her entitlement without a stolen charity fund to cushion her fall. I learned these sparse details through automated email updates from the district attorney office. I did not attend the preliminary hearings. I did not watch the local news segments dissecting the church collapse. The justice system operates on a timeline of raw data, and I trusted the math to handle the rest. My house transformed into a fortress of unyielding peace. It is a Saturday morning in late January. The early sunlight slants through the kitchen blinds, painting bright, parallel lines across the hardwood floor.
The frantic, nervous energy that used to dictate my weekends is entirely gone. There are no mandatory Sunday dinners looming on the horizon. There are no surprise ambushes waiting at the front door. I am sitting at the granite island, wearing comfortable cotton sweatpants and an oversized knitted sweater. The coffee maker finishes its brewing cycle, emitting a soft, concluding beep that rings out into a quiet, safe home. David stands by the counter, pouring the dark roast into 2 cups. He wears a faded gray t-shirt, his broad shoulders relaxed, the tension of the past year melted away from his posture. He spent the previous evening finishing a complicated transmission rebuild at his shop, but this morning his hands are scrubbed clean of dark engine grease. He walks over and places a cup in front of me. I wrap my fingers around the smooth surface. The warmth of the ceramic mug presses against my palms, sending a steady, grounding heat radiating straight into my chest. David sits across the table. He opens a classic car restoration catalog, flipping through the glossy pages. He looks up, catching my gaze, and a slow, genuine smile spreads across his face. It is an uncomplicated, authentic expression. There is no hidden agenda in his eyes. There is no required performance, no dress code, no expected script. We are just a husband and a wife, sharing a quiet morning in a sanctuary we protected with everything we had. We are guarding a new truth. It is not the toxic, suffocating brand of secret my mother utilized to protect her social standing. It is a sacred, fragile joy we are nurturing in the privacy of our own 4 walls. I am 20 weeks pregnant. The journey back to this point required walking through a gauntlet of fear. We navigated the first trimester with held breath, guarding our hearts against the shadows of the past. I tracked the passing weeks on my calendar with the cautious precision of an auditor examining a delicate ledger. But 3 days ago, we sat in a different medical clinic, holding hands and watched a strong, rapid heartbeat pulsing rhythmically across the ultrasound screen. We saw a healthy spine. We saw tiny, perfect fingers. The technician printed a small, grainy photograph. I did not hide it in a box. I pinned it directly to the center of the corkboard above my home office desk, right next to the calendar. We have not posted a clever announcement on the internet. We have not mailed out elegant calligraphed cards. We have not invited a single extended relative over to celebrate. We are keeping this child entirely to ourselves. The spare room at the end of the second-floor hallway is no longer a closed, silent tomb. David unlocked the deadbolt months ago. He unboxed the handcrafted mahogany crib, assembling the heavy wooden rails with his precise, capable hands. We painted the walls a soft, calming shade of sage green. We folded the small yellow socks and placed them inside the top drawer of the dresser. The room is ready, waiting for a life that will never know the burden of conditional love. I look down at my stomach, resting my hand over the subtle curve hidden beneath my thick sweater. The baby flutters a light, distinct movement that sends a wave of fierce gratitude washing over my heart. This quiet moment clarifies the ultimate lesson of the past year. Surviving a toxic family is a brutal, exhausting war of attrition. They train you to believe your worth is tied to their approval, your truth is subjective, and your pain is merely a tool for their convenience. You spend decades twisting yourself into unrecognizable shapes just to avoid their wrath. But true victory does not consist of merely exposing the abusers who tried to destroy you. True victory is not found in watching their empires fall or reading the desperate, groveling apologies of the hypocrites who enabled them. True victory is building a beautiful life they are no longer allowed to touch. Barbara will never hold this baby. Richard will never carve a turkey at our Thanksgiving table. Sarah will never walk through our front door to demand our possessions to decorate her own life. They are locked outside the gates of our future, stranded in the barren wasteland they created for themselves. I reclaimed my narrative, and in doing so, I reclaimed my capacity to trust, to love, and to build a family founded on undeniable honesty. The ledger is finally balanced. The audit is officially closed. If you have ever been the villain in a story written by people who needed to hide their own sins, remember this. They can argue with your emotions, but they cannot argue with the receipts. That is my story. The silence is broken, the truth is documented, and the quiet courage of walking away stands as the final word. If this journey resonated with your own struggles, or if it reminded you to stand firm in your own reality, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below, hit the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a like so you never miss an episode. I will see you in the next one.